Odysseus, king of Ithaca, is remembered less for ruling at home than for the long delay before he returns. In Homer's Odyssey, the journey begins after Troy has fallen and stretches across years of wandering, with the gods repeatedly altering its course. Athena favors Odysseus, Poseidon opposes him, and other divine figures appear at key moments. The poem also comes from an older oral tradition, where details could shift from one telling to another. That uncertainty is part of why the story endures. It is not only a return voyage, but a record of how Greeks imagined cunning, endurance, hospitality, and the cost of separation. From the first departure to the final approach to Ithaca, the poem follows a man trying to come home while the world keeps testing that possibility. Before the war, Odysseus belongs to Ithaca as much as he belongs to the wider Greek world. In the Homeric tradition, he is not a king defined by spectacle or brute force. He is a ruler with a household, an inheritance, and a reputation for thinking ahead. Ithaca is small beside the great mainland kingdoms of the epic world, and that is part of the point. Odysseus is not presented as a distant conqueror. He is a local king whose authority rests on continuity at home, on land held, on kin and servants, and on the expectation that a ruler will return to the place he left. That local identity matters because Homeric kingship is not simply a matter of title. A basileus in the world reflected by the poems leads through personal authority, visible wealth, and ongoing relationships with followers. A king's standing depends on gifts, hospitality, land, and the support of leading families around him. Odysseus is therefore not a ruler in the later bureaucratic sense. He is tied to a network of obligations that can survive only if the household remains intact. Ithaca is not just a backdrop, it is the center of his legitimacy. If the house weakens, the kingship weakens with it. His wife is Penelope, and in the surviving epic tradition she becomes one of the clearest markers of his home life. Later readers often remember her for patience, but in the poem she is also a practical figure who manages pressure, delay, and uncertainty inside the house. Their son, Telemachus, is still young when the long absence begins, which means Odysseus' return is not only a personal homecoming. It is also a question of succession, property, and whether a royal household can survive without its head. That domestic setting matters because the Odyssey is not just about travel. It is about what happens when the bond between ruler and home is stretched so far that it becomes fragile. The oldest literary source we have in full is Homer's Odyssey, but Homer is working with an older tradition. Odysseus likely circulated in oral song before the poem was fixed in writing, and that older world already knew him as a man of intelligence, speech, and improvisation. He is sometimes called polytropos in Greek, a difficult word that points to versatility, many turns, and a mind that can move in more than one direction. That quality separates him from heroes like Achilles, whose power is direct and whose status depends on battlefield excellence. Odysseus can fight, but the tradition usually prizes him for strategy, disguise, persuasion, and restraint under pressure. He is the hero who can listen, calculate, and adapt. That difference helps explain why he matters in Greek myth. The heroic world does not reward only strength. It also rewards intelligence when intelligence can solve problems that force cannot. Odysseus represents a kind of kingship that depends on planning, on reading people correctly, and on surviving situations where open force would fail. In later Greek literature and art, that reputation grows stronger. He becomes the man of cunning among the Achaeans, the one other leaders rely on when a problem requires words or deception rather than brute strength. At the same time, the same quality makes him ambiguous. A clever hero can be useful to a king, but he can also seem dangerous, since cleverness can shade into manipulation. That tension is part of the ancient character. The sources do not present him as a flawless ideal. Even in the earliest surviving poems, he can be patient, calculating, and loyal, but also secretive, proud, and willing to risk more than he should. Those traits are already present before Troy enters the story. The household at Ithaca gives them context. He is a husband, a father, and a ruler who must preserve order in a small kingdom, while also fitting himself into the larger network of Greek alliance and obligation. In the mythic background, that network matters because kings are rarely isolated. They are bound by guest friendship, marriage ties, oaths, and expectations that can draw them into conflicts far beyond their own island. The later tradition also makes clear that Odysseus' place in the war was not accidental. He is one of the Greek leaders brought into the Trojan expedition, and in some versions he tries to avoid the campaign at first. Different sources place this hesitation differently, but the pattern is familiar enough. A man known for intelligence is also known for caution. The war at Troy would pull him away from the daily work of kingship and into a setting where reputation, alliances, and obligations became larger than the island home he ruled. That shift matters because it changes the scale of the story. On Ithaca, Odysseus is measured by stability. At Troy, and in the stories that follow, he will be measured by endurance. So before the war begins, Odysseus stands in a stable place. Odysseus enters the Trojan War as one of the Greek kings drawn into a common obligation. And that obligation begins with Helen. In the surviving tradition, the war does not begin as a single clear decision. It grows out of a disputed marriage, a breach of hospitality, and an oath that bound the great men of Greece to support Helen's husband if she were ever taken away. Homer's Iliad begins after that crisis has already occurred, while later summaries and mythographers explain the earlier causes more directly. However, the story is arranged, the result is the same. A coalition is formed, and Odysseus is called to join it. The usual explanation for how so many rulers could be gathered is the oath of the suitors. In later Greek tradition, before Helen's marriage was settled, her suitors swore to defend the man who won her hand against any future challenger. That detail is not fully spelled out in Homer, but it appears in later sources as a formal basis for the war. The conflict is not presented as a private quarrel alone. It becomes a shared obligation among kings who had once competed for the same woman. Marriage alliances could shape the politics of entire regions, and a promise made in a courtship setting could later become the foundation for military action. Odysseus belongs to that world, but he is not always shown as eager for it. Several ancient traditions make him reluctant to leave Ithaca. He has a household there, and in some versions Penelope and the infant Telemachus are already in place when the summons comes. That reluctance fits the Odysseus of later Greek literature because he is often the man who sees the cost before others do. He is useful in counsel, but he is not the hero who rushes toward war without weighing it. This also separates him from figures like Achilles, whose fame rests on direct martial excellence. Odysseus belongs to a different heroic type. His value lies in judgment as well as force, and a war led by kings needs both. One well-known version of his call to Troy says that he tried to avoid the expedition by pretending to be mad. This episode belongs to later mythic tradition rather than Homer's own narrative of the war. In that story, Odysseus plows with an ox and a donkey yoked together, driving them across salt instead of soil as if he has lost his mind. Palamedes, another clever figure in the Trojan cycle, exposes the deception by placing Telemachus before the plow. Odysseus stops, and the act shows that he was never insane. The tale is memorable not only because it shows his intelligence, but because it shows the pressure the Greek alliance could apply. Once his son and his obligations are brought into view, he cannot remain behind in Ithaca. The episode also explains, in mythic form, why Odysseus is remembered as one who would delay when delay was possible, yet still yield when the social bonds around him became unavoidable. Other traditions are less dramatic. They simply place Odysseus among the kings who answered the summons to Troy. That version is closer to the Homeric poems, which assume his presence rather than explain the decision to go. The Iliad opens with the war already underway, and Odysseus already part of the Greek command. Later summaries make the gathering explicit and place him among the leaders assembled under Agamemnon. Menelaus gives the expedition its most immediate personal claim, but Agamemnon's position as High King gives the coalition its shape. In many later accounts, the army is not a spontaneous crowd of warriors, but a controlled gathering of allied rulers, each bringing ships, men, and local standing to a broader cause. That larger gathering matters because it shows how Greek heroic culture imagined collective action. No single ruler could simply command the whole expedition without lineage, alliances, and some shared reason for obedience. Odysseus belongs in that setting because he can move between different kinds of power. He is not the strongest fighter in the camp. He is the man who can speak, plan, delay, and decide when force should be used and when it should wait. In a force as uneasy as the Greek army at Troy, that kind of intelligence is indispensable. Later tradition often places him in the political space between rank and action, where arguments have to be settled before spears are raised. That is one reason he remains so important even when the story is not centered on him. He can translate between the will of kings and the practical needs of an army. The myths also preserve the tension between duty and self-protection. Odysseus is rarely shown as someone who seeks glory at any cost. That makes his departure more significant. He does not go because war is attractive. He goes because the structure of heroic obligation leaves him little room to refuse. Guest friendship, marriage ties, honor among kings, and the pressure of collective decision all close around him. The oath that once protected Helen now helps launch the expedition that will divide households across Greece. This is part of what gives the Trojan cycle its lasting force in Greek tradition. A promise intended to preserve order becomes the mechanism that sends men away from their homes for years, and the consequences spread far beyond one marriage. So when the ships begin to gather, Odysseus is not yet the long-suffering wanderer of the Odyssey. Before Troy becomes the setting for the best-known Greek war stories, Odysseus is already marked by caution. In the epic tradition, that caution is not a flaw, it is part of his usefulness. He knows how to delay, bargain, and choose the less costly path when direct action would only cause more damage. That quality appears most clearly in the traditions that describe his efforts to avoid the expedition altogether. When the call to Troy reached Ithaca, several ancient versions say Odysseus did not hurry to join the ships. The war had grown out of promises and obligations that reached beyond one king's private life. Helen's departure, whether described in early poetry as abduction or in some later retellings as a voluntary departure, had drawn together a coalition of Greek leaders. The oath linked to her former suitors meant that many of them were expected to act if her marriage was challenged. Odysseus had helped shape that oath, and later tradition preserves the irony that the man who helped design the political answer was eventually caught by it. The war was already larger than any one household. It was a test of whether spoken commitments could hold together a world of rival kings, family claims, and inherited reputation. The best-known story of his reluctance comes from later summaries and mythographic tradition rather than from the Iliad itself. In that account, Odysseus tries to avoid the war by pretending to be mad. He is said to have yoked together an unusual pair of animals, sometimes a horse and an ox, and to have begun ploughing while sowing salt instead of grain. The point of the story is not the farming detail, it is the test of character. Odysseus is shown as someone able to hide his intention behind an outward performance, which fits the wider pattern of his myth. He understands appearances and knows how to use them. The gesture also has a practical edge. Ploughing belonged to settled life, to planting and continuity, while the salt made the labor pointless. The image suggests an attempt to look harmless and impractical, as if he had stepped out of the role expected of a king. That disguise could not last forever. In the familiar version, Palamedes, a figure from later Trojan cycle tradition, exposes the deception by placing the infant Telemachus in front of the plough. Odysseus stops, and that reaction proves he was never truly mad. This episode is not equally prominent in every ancient source, but it became one of the clearest explanations for why he went to Troy despite himself. The story preserves a simple idea. Wit can postpone duty, but it cannot always remove it. Later writers sometimes use Palamedes as the man who sees through trickery where others do not, and that gives the episode a second layer of tension. Odysseus is not only caught, he is caught by a sharper use of the same practical intelligence he relies on. The important point is that Odysseus does not come to war because he loves it. He is pushed into it by oath, alliance, and public obligation. His intelligence has already made him valuable in council, and now that same intelligence becomes part of the reason he cannot remain at home. If he had really been insane, the army would have sailed without him. The fact that he was not gives the episode its force. There are limits to evasion. A man can delay a decision, but he cannot always escape the claims made on him by his own actions. The tradition is careful about that. It does not present him as innocent, only as reluctant. He has helped build the structure that now catches him. That makes the story feel less like a comic prank and more like a recognition of how obligation works in heroic society. Later tradition often treats this episode as a moral turning point. Odysseus is clever enough to invent an escape, but not clever enough to step outside kingship and alliance. That distinction mattered in heroic culture. A ruler was judged not only by battlefield strength, but by loyalty to sworn agreements, household duties, and public commitments. The feigned madness shows a man trying to withdraw from those claims. The attempt fails, his true identity is exposed, and the road to Troy becomes unavoidable. In some versions, the pressure comes from the community itself, which refuses to let a prominent king hide behind private distress. In others, it is the moral force of the oath that closes in on him. Either way, the result is the same. He is brought back into the public world he tried to avoid. That failure also helps define how Greek tradition wanted audiences to see him. Odysseus is not Achilles. He is not the most overwhelming fighter in the army, and he is not valued mainly for sheer force. He is the man whose mind can open a way forward, but whose mind must still answer to obligations larger than private choice. Once he is compelled to sail, the same skill that almost kept him in Ithaca becomes useful to the Greeks. He will be needed for speeches, negotiations, messages, and practical solutions when weapons are not enough. This is one reason the later epic tradition keeps returning to him whenever a problem requires calculation rather than a charge into battle. His value lies partly in the fact that he understands when force is wasteful. When the Greek fleet reaches the coast of Asia Minor, the war does not begin with one clean assault. In Homer and the wider epic tradition, Troy is already a fortified city with allies, walls, and a long record of conflict. The landing is only the opening move in a campaign that will last for years. The Greeks have come as a coalition, not as a single army. Each chief brings his own followers, rank, and claim to honor. That matters, because Odysseus at Troy is not the story of a man who wins by force alone. It is the story of someone who keeps becoming useful when the war is no longer simple. The early phase of the siege is less famous than the later crises, but it establishes the pattern. The Greeks raid the surrounding region, pressure the Trojans, and test the city's allies. Troy does not fall quickly. In the surviving poems, the war unfolds through delays, reprisals, local victories, and losses on both sides. That slow pace shapes Odysseus's role. A battle hero can win a charge. A prolonged campaign demands planning, persuasion, timing, and the ability to work inside a tense command structure. Odysseus becomes one of the men the army turns to when action has to be joined with judgment. That is why he appears so often in roles that are not always glamorous in later retellings. He carries messages, he joins councils, he helps settle disputes between powerful men. He can argue in public and then work quietly in the background when direct confrontation would be wasteful. In the Iliad, the clearest surviving epic poem about the war, he is repeatedly shown as a speaker who can steady the army or help shape a decision. Later mythographers and tragedians preserve that image, even when they expand it in different directions. He is not merely cunning in the narrow sense of trickery. He is practical intelligence under pressure. The Greek leaders themselves make that quality necessary. Agamemnon holds the nominal command, but his authority is not strong enough to settle every dispute. Achilles has unmatched fighting power, but he is difficult to manage. Nestor can advise, but advice is not the same as action. Ajax is strong and steady, but not subtle. Odysseus sits among them as a different kind of resource. He is the man who can see what can actually be done, not only what ought to be said. As the siege stretches on, that becomes more valuable. The war does not reward force alone. It rewards anyone who can keep the coalition from breaking apart. Ancient tradition also places Odysseus in episodes where his intelligence is tested against the tension of the camp itself. In some later summaries, and in the broader mythic cycle around the war, he appears in embassies, scouting, and internal arguments that show how fragile the Greek alliance can be. The exact incident may vary from source to source, but the larger pattern stays the same. Odysseus does not merely fight Troy, he helps manage the Greek side of the war. This is also the point at which the story sharpens one of the most durable contrasts in Greek heroic culture. Achilles represents direct excellence, the kind that brings immediate glory but also immediate crisis. Odysseus represents adaptable intelligence, which is less visible in a single moment and more useful across a long campaign. Neither quality is enough by itself. Troy forces the Greeks to depend on both. When one fails, the other becomes more necessary. The siege years are not always narrated in full because the tradition is selective. It preserves what later audiences found meaningful: councils, raids, disputes, and tactical turning points. Odysseus belongs especially to the moments when a decision has to be made under uncertainty. A messenger must cross dangerous ground. A plan must be framed so that other chiefs will accept it. A problem must be solved before it becomes a disaster. Those are the tasks that turn him from a soldier into an indispensable one. Even before the great crisis involving Achilles, that pattern is already in place. The Greek camp has become a place where personal honor, shared obligation, and military necessity compete. Odysseus can move within that world because he understands all three. He knows how to speak to kings, how to manage soldiers, and how to improvise when the expected course fails. As the war settles into stalemate, that combination matters more than brute strength alone. Troy has not fallen, the fighting has not ended, and the Greeks need the man who can keep difficult things moving. Odysseus has become exactly that, and the next great pressure on the army will show how far his usefulness can be stretched. The broader mythic sequence also places Odysseus among the men who understand that a siege is not only a contest of arms, it is a contest of endurance, supply, morale, and alliances. Homer does not explain all of that in historical terms, but the world behind the poem makes the situation clearer. A coalition army on foreign ground depends on shipping, on cooperation among aristocratic leaders, and on the constant management of disputes over honor and reward. If those relationships fail, the campaign can fail with them. That is one reason the Trojan War in epic is always more than a battlefield story. It is also a story about authority under strain. Odysseus fits that environment because he can move between levels of responsibility. He is not the highest king, and he is not the strongest fighter. He is the man who can enter a council and then return to the line, or speak for the army and then take up the practical work behind the speech. In later literature, This flexibility becomes one of his defining traits. It is already visible in the war years at Troy, where survival often depends on recognizing that the obvious answer is not always the workable one. The surviving tradition also leaves room for different emphases. Some versions stress Odysseus as a persuasive spokesman, others stress his caution, his scouting, or his ability to handle risky commissions. The details shift, but the function stays the same. He is valuable because he can do work that neither raw strength nor formal rank can do by itself. In a story dominated by men whose honor is measured in public display, that kind of usefulness can be easy to overlook. Yet the war keeps proving that without it, the Greek coalition would be less stable. Achilles becomes the central problem of the war when Agamemnon takes Briseis from him. In the Iliad, this is not a physical wound, but a wound in status, and that distinction matters in the heroic world of the poem. Agamemnon has already been forced to return Chryseis, and he claims compensation by seizing Briseis, Achilles' own prize. The act is public, which makes it severe. It tells everyone in the Greek camp who outranks whom, even if the answer is unstable. The quarrel does not begin in isolation. At the opening of the Iliad, the Greek army is already under pressure from Apollo's plague, sent after Agamemnon refuses to release Chryseis to her father, the priest Chryses. Achilles is the one who calls the assembly and presses for a solution, so he begins as a defender of the army's interests. When Agamemnon gives up Chryseis, he does not let the matter end there. He insists on taking another war prize, and he chooses Briseis from Achilles' tent. In epic terms, this is more than theft. A war prize is visible proof of achievement. It marks a man's place in the hierarchy of the camp. To remove it in front of others is to deny the standing that earned it. That is why Achilles' anger is so intense in the poem. He is not only insulted in private, he is stripped in public after having fought for the expedition's success. Homer presents this as a crisis of recognition. Achilles has won honor through battle, but Agamemnon can still assert authority through rank and distribution. The tension between those two kinds of power runs through the entire scene. One comes from leading the coalition, the other from being the best fighter in it. The Iliad does not pretend those claims fit together easily. Achilles responds by withdrawing from the fighting, and that decision changes the course of the poem. The Greeks have come to Troy as a coalition, not as a single unified army. Their leaders are kings with their own followers, their own honor, and their own obligations. Agamemnon is the nominal commander, but his authority depends on persuasion and respect as much as command. Once Achilles refuses to fight, the Greeks lose their strongest warrior, and the Trojans, led by Hector, begin to gain ground. What had already been a long siege becomes much more dangerous. Homer shows that danger in practical terms. The Greek lines begin to falter. Hector pushes forward. The camp has to rely on defensive walls, careful positioning, and the courage of other champions to delay disaster. Men like Ajax and Diomedes keep fighting, but the balance of force has changed. Achilles' absence does not merely subtract one man from the battlefield, it alters the logic of the war. The Greeks can no longer expect direct superiority in combat to solve everything. They have to endure, negotiate, and improvise. This is where Odysseus becomes especially important. He is not presented as the greatest fighter among the Greeks, and the epic does not treat him that way. His strength lies elsewhere. He can speak clearly, judge other men's temper, and carry out the difficult work of keeping a divided alliance from breaking apart. In a war built on competing claims of honor, that skill matters. Once Achilles steps away, the Greeks cannot rely on force alone to settle their problems. They need negotiation, planning, and a way to keep leaders from turning on one another. Homer shows the strain of this crisis in several ways. The Greeks try to hold defensive positions. They send other champions forward. They fall back on strategy because their best fighter is absent. Later in the poem, Odysseus will be part of the embassy sent to Achilles in an attempt to bring him back. But the larger pattern is already clear before that scene arrives. The army is trying to survive without the man who once gave it its greatest advantage. That makes the conflict broader than a personal insult. It becomes a test of whether the Greek expedition can still function when one of its leading men refuses to take part. Ancient audiences would have understood why this mattered. Heroic honor was personal, but war was communal. A leader could not simply command loyalty by rank alone. He had to sustain it through gifts, recognition, and public respect. When those bonds break, the army does not only lose manpower, it loses cohesion. Men who are proud and heavily armed do not stay united for long if they feel dishonored. Achilles' anger exposes that weakness, and the poem does not soften the consequences. For Odysseus, this is a revealing moment. He belongs to the group of leaders who understand that success depends on reading other people correctly. He can see that the Greeks are now fighting two battles at once, one against Troy and one against the instability inside their own camp. That is why the withdrawal of Achilles matters so much in the larger journey. It shifts the war away from simple heroics and toward judgment, management, and survival. Once Achilles has withdrawn, the Greeks cannot simply replace him and continue as before. In Homer's Iliad, that is the problem. The war is not only a test of strength, it is also a system of gifts, honor, and public standing. A leader who feels slighted may fight less effectively, or not at all. That is why Odysseus is sent as part of an embassy, not as a commander of troops. His task is to repair a broken relationship by persuasion, compensation, and careful speech. The embassy belongs to the social logic of heroic culture. In the world reflected by Homer, status is made visible in the distribution of spoils, the giving of gifts, and the public acknowledgement of worth. Agamemnon has insulted Achilles by taking Briseis, and now he tries to make amends with a formal offer of restitution. The poem preserves a long list of gifts that includes tripods, horses, gold, and women skilled in household labor. The point is not only wealth, it is an attempt to reverse dishonor in public. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix are sent to deliver that message, each in a different style and with a different appeal. The scene also shows how the Iliad understands leadership. Agamemnon is still the high king of the coalition, but his authority is limited. He can convene an embassy, offer compensation, and promise future status, yet he cannot simply command Achilles back into the field. That limitation fits the poem's larger picture of the Greek host, an alliance of powerful households, not a modern army with a chain of command that can compel obedience at every level. A dispute between leading men can affect the whole campaign. The embassy is therefore not a side episode. It is a test of whether a war effort held together by honor can survive one public rupture. Odysseus is the most calculated of the three. He speaks first because he can frame the argument in practical terms. He reminds Achilles of the danger facing the Greeks and of the honors being offered to him if he returns. In the poem, this is a speech built around necessity as much as pride. He does not flatter Achilles for its own sake. He presents a situation in which the entire army suffers from one man's withdrawal, and he emphasizes that the Greeks are willing to meet Achilles with compensation. This is one of the clearest places where Odysseus appears as an interpreter of motive. He understands that a hero does not always want truth in the abstract. He wants a path back to standing. The timing of this appeal matters. Achilles has already spent time apart from the fighting, and the poem has shown the cost of that absence. Greek losses mount, the battlefield balance shifts, and the pressure on the coalition increases. Odysseus does not enter the tent as a neutral messenger. He arrives when the need is urgent and visible. That urgency gives the speech its force, but it also exposes its weakness. If honor has been violated in public, then a purely practical argument may not be enough. Achilles is being asked to accept that his value can be restored through gifts and promises, while he himself feels that the injury has reached something deeper. Phoenix follows with a very different appeal. He is older, more intimate, and more like a father figure to Achilles. His speech looks backward to the habits of nurture, teaching, and obligation. In some readings, it is the most emotionally forceful part of the embassy because it asks Achilles to remember not just his rank, but his human ties. Phoenix speaks from personal attachment, and that attachment gives his words a different kind of authority. If Odysseus argues from military necessity, Phoenix argues from memory and upbringing. He tries to reconnect Achilles to the relationships that shaped him before the quarrel hardened into principle. Ajax, by contrast, speaks bluntly and with visible disappointment. He does not try to unravel Achilles' feelings. He simply points out that refusal is out of step with the needs of the army. His style matters because it shows another side of heroic culture, the expectation that a man of rank should respond to communal pressure, not only to private grievance. Ajax does not offer subtle persuasion. He delivers the plain social judgment that Achilles' stance is isolating him from his companions. Together, the three envoys represent three kinds of persuasion: reason, memory, and communal pressure. Odysseus is especially important because his response is not sentimental. He does not deny that Achilles has been wronged, and he does not pretend that gifts erase the insult in a simple way. What he does is lay out the practical consequences of continued refusal. In Homeric terms, that is a sophisticated form of speech. It assumes that people are moved by recognition, by loss, and by the prospect of future honor. Odysseus can translate a political crisis into terms a wounded hero must hear, even if he cannot make Achilles agree. That ability to mediate between public need and private emotion is one of the qualities later Greek tradition repeatedly associates with him. Achilles does not accept the offer. He is moved, but not enough. The poem is careful here. His anger is not irrational in a simple sense, because he has been publicly humiliated, yet his response also shows how destructive heroic honor can become when it turns inward and refuses compromise. He tells Odysseus that no amount of gifts can restore what has been lost. He says in effect that a life cannot be bought back once dishonor has taken root. That answer matters because it reveals the limits of the heroic gift system. Compensation can repair many things in Homeric society, but not everything. Some injuries become personal absolutes. The refusal also sharpens the emotional structure of the Iliad. Achilles is not merely angry at Agamemnon. He is thinking about his own life, his future, and the meaning of his excellence if it cannot be properly recognized. In later storytelling, this scene is often read as a debate over pride or as a warning about the cost of anger. Those are later emphases. In the Iliad itself, the immediate issue is that the Greek coalition cannot function when its best fighter stands aside. The poem is less interested in abstract morality than in the consequences of damaged reciprocity. Once exchange fails, so does the order built on exchange. There are later traditions that make this scene feel more like a moral lesson about Achilles' fate, or about the danger of pride in general. In the Iliad itself, the more immediate issue is that the Greek coalition cannot function when its best fighter stands aside. Odysseus learns something important from the failure. He sees that diplomacy has its place, but it cannot force consent where resentment has hardened. That knowledge will matter again and again in the return journey, where survival depends less on open battle than on reading what people can and cannot be made to do. The embassy does not end the war. After the embassy fails, the war does not become simpler. It becomes more dependent on the men who can keep the Greek army functioning when the strongest warrior will not return to the line. In Homer's Iliad, that is where Odysseus appears most clearly as a practical commander rather than a champion of sheer force. He is not usually the man who breaks the enemy front by himself. He is the man who keeps plans moving, carries messages, and sees what the larger struggle requires. Later summaries often reduce him to the clever hero, but the poem builds that reputation through specific scenes. He organizes men, restrains panic, and speaks in assemblies where the army could easily collapse into noise. Greek heroic culture still prizes courage in open combat, yet it also depends on counsel. A leader has to know when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to wait. Odysseus belongs to that second kind of excellence, the kind that is harder to notice from a distance but essential in practice. One of the clearest examples comes in the night operations around Troy. In the Iliad and in later epic tradition, Odysseus is often paired with Diomedes, a younger warrior who can match him in speed and aggression. Together they carry out a raid against the Trojan camp, moving in darkness when open battle would be too costly. They gather intelligence, disrupt the enemy, and return before daylight. The point is not only that they succeed, it is that success can come from timing, caution, and coordination, not just from direct force. Night movement, scouting, and surprise were familiar realities in ancient warfare, and epic poetry uses them to show that war is decided by more than a heroic charge. The sources do not always give the same sequence for these smaller exploits. Some belong firmly to Homeric poetry, while others survive more fully in later summaries and retellings of the Trojan cycle. That is typical of the tradition. The Iliad gives a concentrated view of the war and other ancient poems, now mostly lost, filled in different parts of the larger story. Later writers expanded those scenes again. But across the tradition, the image stays steady. Odysseus is the man sent when a problem has to be solved with more than strength. That role becomes even clearer in the way he speaks to others. In Greek heroic culture, counsel is not separate from battle. Advice can decide whether a coalition holds together. Odysseus is often the figure who can address different kinds of men in different tones. He can speak firmly to a soldier, carefully to a rival king, or persuasively before an assembly. That flexibility matters because the Greek host is not a single army under one ruler. It is a coalition of separate leaders, each with his own pride and authority. Keeping them aligned is a constant task, especially during a long siege, when fatigue, resentment, and competition for prestige build up. This is one reason later tradition keeps returning to Odysseus as a planner. He is useful because he does not rely on a single mode of action. When a violent solution is needed, he can take part in it. When a quieter one is better, he can shift. Homer does not present that adaptability as dishonorable. It is necessary. The war around Troy is not won by muscle alone, and the men who endure it are often the ones who can respond to changing conditions. There is also a darker edge to these episodes. Intelligence in war often requires risk, and risk in epic can shade into deception. Odysseus is comfortable with that border. He can hide his intention, disguise a purpose, or move under cover of night. In a heroic world that values openness and fame, this makes him unusual, but it also makes him effective. The poems do not reduce this to a simple contrast between honesty and fraud. They treat it as a recognition that war has multiple forms and that not all of them can be fought in the bright center of the battlefield. In the Greek imagination, a man who can speak and maneuver is not merely avoiding combat, he is serving the larger survival of the expedition. The Iliad also places Odysseus in moments where order has to be restored from within the army itself. That matters because the Greek side is not a unified nation in the later sense. It is a gathering of kings, each responsible for his own followers and each sensitive to insult, reward, and status. When Achilles withdraws, the loss is not only military, it is social. The army loses its greatest fighter, but it also loses the balance his presence imposed on everyone else. In that setting, a leader like Odysseus becomes indispensable. He can move between ranks and restore a line of argument before it turns into disorder. Homer gives this practical intelligence a particular dignity. Odysseus is not celebrated for spectacle alone. He is admired because his judgment has consequences. He knows how to approach a crowd when fear is spreading. He knows when to press a point and when to hold back. In a poem that often measures greatness by visible deeds, these are quieter forms of excellence, but they are not lesser ones. They are what keep a campaign intact when the obvious solutions fail. That is why the night raids matter so much in the larger arc of the war. They show the same qualities in compressed form. Darkness removes the protections of open combat, so success depends on discipline, shared purpose, and the ability to read opportunity quickly. A raid can gather information, strike a vulnerable target, or unsettle an enemy camp without committing the whole army to a costly fight. The final capture of Troy follows the same pattern as the rest of the war, even if it is the best-known version of the victory. In the surviving tradition, the Greeks do not take the city by force alone. After years of stalemate, they turn to deception, and Odysseus is often the Greek most closely tied to that turn. The familiar version is the wooden horse, a hidden structure that allows armed men to enter the city after the Trojans have been persuaded to bring it inside their walls. But even this episode survives in more than one form, and the ancient sources do not all tell it the same way. Homer's Iliad does not narrate the horse, because the poem ends before Troy falls. The horse belongs to later epic tradition, especially the lost poems of the Trojan cycle, and it is summarized by later authors such as tragedians and Roman poets. That matters because the horse is already a later shaping of the war's ending, not a scene from the main surviving epic of Achilles. In the broad tradition, the scheme is straightforward. The Greeks seem to withdraw, leaving behind a massive horse as an offering, or at least as something meant to be understood that way. The Trojans debate what to do with it. Some versions emphasize warning voices that are ignored. Others preserve the idea that the horse is treated as a sacred object, or as a prize tied to Athena, which makes the deception more effective because the city is not just fooled, but persuaded to accept the gift. Inside the horse are selected Greek warriors, and when night comes, they emerge and open the gates for the returning army. Troy is then taken from within. In some later summaries, the Greeks also send a false message about departure or present the horse as a memorial for safe passage home, showing how flexible the tradition became as poets and mythographers tried to explain how a city with strong walls could still be breached. The core image stays the same, but the surrounding details shift from source to source. Odysseus fits this kind of victory because it matches the skills the poems already attach to him. He is the one who thinks in layers. He can plan a stratagem, carry it through, and adapt when circumstances change. In some traditions, he is the inventor of the horse itself, or at least the chief organizer of the plan. In others, the credit is shared more broadly, and the poems present the horse as the work of the Greek coalition rather than one man alone. But even where the authorship is not exclusive, Odysseus is repeatedly the figure whose mind makes the deception possible. That is the same quality that made him useful in smaller operations before this point, only now it is applied to the largest problem of the war. It also fits the way later Greek and Roman writers like to define him. Achilles represents speed and force. Ajax represents direct strength. Odysseus represents planning, speech, concealment, and the ability to survive by reading a situation better than other men do. There are also other traditions about Troy's fall that stand beside the horse rather than beneath it. Ancient summaries preserve accounts of scouts, secret entry, and the use of disguise or infiltration. The exact sequence differs, and later retellings often condense separate episodes into one familiar scene. Some versions give a larger role to Cyclops, the Greek who persuades the Trojans to accept the horse. Others make the priest Laocoon a warning figure whose death helps silence resistance. In Virgil's Aeneid, the horse becomes a carefully arranged fraud, and Laocoon's warnings are overridden by signs the Trojans interpret as divine approval. Those are later literary treatments, not the oldest surviving form of the tale, but they show how the myth grew around the same central problem. The city cannot be taken by ordinary assault, so it is taken by a breach in judgment. What remains stable is the principle. Troy falls because the Greeks find a way to enter a city that could not be stormed openly. In a mythic culture that often praises direct combat, this ending is notable. The decisive act is not a duel but a stratagem. That does not make the victory less heroic in the ancient tradition. It makes it the kind of heroic act Odysseus can perform. The capture of Troy also carries a darker implication. A city does not simply fall and disappear from the story. The poems and later traditions remember the deaths, losses, and desecration that follow. Cassandra, Priam, Hector's family, and other figures attached to the city's end become part of the wider memory of the war. Different texts assign different details and different levels of violence, but the outcome is consistent. The victory is complete, and it is also ruinous. Greek triumph does not erase the suffering that made the war famous. That tension helps explain why the end of the siege does not bring Odysseus rest. It begins a second ordeal. In some traditions, even the sack of the city includes acts that offend the gods, which later poets use to explain why the returning Greeks do not sail home safely. The conquerors have succeeded, but they have also crossed into the aftermath of destruction, where victory and punishment begin to overlap. For Odysseus, the fall of Troy is not a clean conclusion. It is the moment when the war ends, but the journey home begins under a darker cloud. Ancient tradition often treats this as the point where divine anger starts to gather against the returning Greeks. Some stories connect the violence at Troy itself to later punishment. Others stress the insults offered to the gods, the disorder that follows conquest, or the simple fact that no victory of this scale can escape consequence. Whatever version one follows, the return voyage is not framed as a reward, it is framed as an accounting. The Greeks have taken the city, but they have not settled the cost. This is why the fall of Troy stands at the hinge of Odysseus's whole legend. It is the greatest proof of his usefulness, and also the beginning of the long reckoning that follows usefulness after war. The sack of Troy is where Odysseus's journey changes direction. The city has fallen, but in Homer's Odyssey and in the wider Greek tradition, that victory is not an ending in any simple sense. Ancient audiences would have understood why. A triumph won through years of violence could still draw divine anger if the winners overstepped, dishonored sacred places, or acted as though conquest put them beyond ordinary limits. The war is over, but the moral balance of the story is not. Different traditions place that danger in different details. Some later accounts focus on specific acts of sacrilege during Troy's fall, especially the abuse of holy spaces or sacred images. Others keep the warning broader and less tied to one incident. They present the sack itself as a moment of excess, when human beings behave as though success has removed all restraint. The Odyssey does not need to choose between every version to make its point. Odysseus and the other survivors leave Troy under a cloud. Their return begins with the sense that the gods are still watching what was done in victory. That sense of unfinished judgment fits the way Greek epic often treats the end of war. In the Iliad, the central conflict is still unfolding, and the cost is immediate. In the Odyssey, the great city has already fallen, and the question becomes what victory is worth once the fighting stops. The poem assumes that conquest does not cancel responsibility. If anything, success creates a new danger, because men who have endured a siege can begin to believe that endurance itself makes them untouchable. Greek audiences knew stories in which that belief was punished. Kings, captains, and cities could win by force and still lose by failing to respect divine limits. Odysseus leaves Troy with the reputation he earned there. He is not defined by brute strength. He matters because he can think, speak, and adapt. He helped bring down Troy through planning and deception, and that skill has made him indispensable. It will also become a liability. Intelligence can solve a siege, but it cannot control every turn of the sea or every temper in a restless crew. Once Troy has fallen, the problem is no longer how to win, it is how to return after winning, when the men who survive the war are most likely to overestimate what they can endure. The qualities that made Odysseus useful in war, especially caution and cleverness, now have to contend with the stubbornness of other men and the uncertainty of divine will. The returning Greeks do not all depart in the same way or arrive home together. In epic tradition, some leave quickly, some are delayed, and some are destroyed by storms or divine hostility. That pattern matters because Greek myth often treats the sea as the place where victory is tested after the battle is already over. On land, armies can hold formation and follow command. At sea, discipline breaks down more easily, and the survivors of war are exposed to weather, error, and anger they cannot manage by force. The voyage home becomes a second kind of conflict, less public than the siege, but no less dangerous. It is not decided by banners or walls. It is decided by obedience, restraint, luck, and the temper of the gods. For Odysseus, the danger is not only outside the ship. His success at Troy makes him a figure of skill, but also a man at risk of pride. Some traditions explain the trouble after the war as punishment for acts committed during the sack, including neglect of the gods or disrespect toward what was sacred. Others use a more general lesson. When people think they have mastered fortune, that is often when fortune turns against them. The Odyssey does not state that idea outright. It shows it through the collapse of the journey. The road home grows difficult because the world no longer yields to the men who took Troy. Even when the cause of their misfortune is not stated with precision, the pattern is clear enough. Victory has not created safety, and confidence has not become control. This shift also changes the scale of the story. The war has been a public event, shaped by armies, kings, and the fate of a city. The return becomes narrower and more fragile. It moves toward one ship, then one man, then one household waiting in Ithaca. That narrowing is part of the punishment. Troy is gone, but Odysseus has not regained anything that matters most to him. Glory has separated him from home instead of restoring it. Every day on the water now measures the distance between victory and recovery. In Homer's poem, this is one of the deepest ironies of the whole tale. The man most famous for helping end the war is the one who must spend years learning that the end of war is not the same as the end of loss. The first stop after Troy is brief in the Odyssey, but it matters because it shows how quickly discipline can vanish once a victorious army thinks the hard part is over. After leaving the coast of Ilium, Odysseus and his men reach the land of the Cicones, a people usually placed in the region of Thrace in Greek tradition. In Homer's telling, they attack the city of Ismarus, take plunder, and kill many of the men there. At first, this looks like another successful raid, the kind of grim victory heroic poetry often treats as a normal part of war. But the story turns almost at once. Odysseus urges his men to leave quickly, while the rest remain by the shore feasting and dividing the spoils. That delay gives the Cicones time to gather reinforcements from inland. They return in force, and the Greeks, caught off guard, are driven back to their ships. Homer gives the episode little explanation, and that brevity is part of its force. He is not trying to provide a full campaign record or a precise geography of Thrace. He is using a small, early failure to establish the shape of the journey. The Cicones episode appears near the beginning of the Odyssey in Book 9 in Odysseus' own retrospective account of his wanderings. That matters because the hero is not simply reporting events. He is choosing the first example of what went wrong after Troy, and he begins with a disaster caused not by divine trickery, but by human impatience. If the men had sailed when Odysseus ordered, they might have escaped with their gains. Instead, they turned a successful raid into a setback by treating the spoil as if the danger were already over. The point is not only that the attack fails. Homer uses the episode to show a pattern that will repeat across the journey home, a moment of success followed by poor judgment, then a loss that could have been avoided. Odysseus is already being set apart from his own crew. He can recognize danger and call for restraint, but he cannot always make others listen. In that sense, the Cicones are the first sign that his real challenge is not only the sea or the gods, it is also the weakness of the men traveling with him, who often mistake immediate gain for security. Their behavior here is not evil in a grand sense. It is ordinary and familiar. They are tired after war, eager to divide plunder, and willing to enjoy the first comforts they have had in a long time. Homer does not excuse them, but he makes the mistake recognizable. The loss that follows is immediate and concrete. Odysseus says that he and his crew lose many companions before they can escape, though the poem does not give a precise number. It is not trying to be a military report. What matters is the scale of the reversal. A fleet that has just helped destroy Troy is pushed back on its first stop home. That creates the first hard lesson of the voyage. The return will not reward the same habits that won the war. In epic terms, this is a sharp correction. The men are still acting as raiders, but they are no longer in a position to endure the consequences of raiding. They have moved from the offensive posture of war into the fragile condition of men trying to get home alive. The episode also fits a wider pattern in Greek tradition about the danger of overreaching after victory. In heroic poetry, plunder is not unusual by itself. It is part of the economy of war, and leaders are often expected to distribute it. But there is a boundary between taking what can be carried and staying until one is vulnerable. Odysseus understands that boundary. His crew does not. The result is not just tactical defeat, but a loss of order within the expedition. Once the men ignore him, the captain's authority is visibly weakened, and that weakness will matter every time a later crisis depends on discipline, trust, and speed. This episode also keeps the journey grounded in the human world before the more famous marvels begin. No god appears here to explain the failure. There is no enchantment, no monster, no divine intervention. The danger comes from ordinary decisions, especially the failure to leave at the right moment. That makes the Cicones a threshold scene. Odysseus has already survived the war, but survival does not yet mean safety. He has won glory, yet the road home begins with wasted time, wounded pride, and dead companions. From here on, every delay will carry a cost, and the voyage that once seemed like a simple return becomes a test of whether he can preserve what remains. There is also a historical echo in the choice of the Cicones as the first post-war encounter. Thrace lay on the edge of the Greek world as Homer knew it, a place associated with distance, roughness, and martial peoples in later Greek imagination. The poem does not need to define the Cicones in detail because they function as an early external obstacle, a local population that resists being treated as easy prey. In that sense, the encounter reminds the listener that the homeward voyage is moving through inhabited lands, not empty space. Odysseus and his men are crossing regions where other communities live, defend themselves, and respond when attacked. The timing of the reversal is especially important. Homer stresses that the Cicones return from inland after the Greeks have already paused to eat and divide the loot. The next island is dangerous in a quieter way. After the rough discipline of the Cicones, the poem moves to a place where violence is not the main threat. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus and his men encounter the lotus eaters, whose food makes those who eat it lose all interest in going home. The episode is brief, but it is one of the clearest examples in the epic of a danger that works by softening the will rather than breaking the body. Homer does not explain the lotus in botanical terms, and later readers have tried to identify it with different plants or with stories from farther afield. That uncertainty has helped the episode endure. The point is not a precise natural history. It is the idea that pleasure, or numbness, can loosen a person's hold on duty, memory, and identity. In a journey defined by nostos, the Greek word for homecoming, forgetting home is no small lapse. It is a form of ruin. Odysseus lands there to find out what kind of place it is. That detail matters, because he is still moving as both explorer and commander. The island is not entered in triumph. It is approached in uncertainty, and the men he sends inland are there to learn what the inhabitants eat and how they live. Instead, they eat the lotus and no longer want to leave. They do not rebel, and they are not cursed in any obvious way. They simply lose urgency. The danger is not pain, but the easing away of purpose. Homer presents the reaction plainly. The men want to remain among the lotus eaters, and they offer no resistance when their companions call them back. Odysseus has to drag the affected men to the ships and bind them so they cannot stay. Once again, he sees the cost of delay before the others do. The action is small by epic standards, but its meaning is serious. If he leaves the men behind, the voyage is not merely delayed. It begins to dissolve. The episode also shows the kind of leader Odysseus is in the older tradition. He is not always the strongest fighter in the Greek camp. He is often the man who notices what others miss, or who understands that a small failure can become a permanent loss. The Lotus Eaters episode gives that intelligence a moral edge. Knowing when to leave matters as much as knowing how to win. A leader can survive war and still fail on the road home if he does not recognize the forms danger can take. It is also one of the first places in the Odyssey where memory becomes central in narrative form. Odysseus is not merely trying to reach a point on a map. He is preserving the chain that connects him to his household, his status, and his name. In Greek epic, those things belong together. A hero without return is not just a traveler who has taken a wrong turn. He is a man whose identity has been interrupted. The lotus threatens that continuity by replacing desire with forgetfulness. There is no single ancient tradition that explains the lotus eaters in the same way. Homer gives the clearest and most influential version, and later summaries usually keep the basic idea of a people tied to forgetting. Modern interpretations sometimes connect them to temptation, narcotic calm, or the seduction of a life without struggle. Those comparisons can be useful, but the epic itself keeps the meaning simpler and harsher. Home can be lost not only through death or violence, but through the surrender of memory. For an audience familiar with the risks of seafaring and exile, that would not have been an abstract lesson. The episode also belongs to a larger pattern in the Odyssey. Before Odysseus reaches monsters, storms, and divine punishments, he must pass through places where choice itself is altered. The Lotus Eaters do not attack in the usual sense. They offer an alternative to return. That makes them a fitting opening obstacle in the long sequence of losses the hero must resist. The poem is patient about this point. It does not say that every danger is sharp and visible. Some dangers arrive as relief. That is what makes Odysseus's intervention important. He does not conquer the Lotus Eaters. He does not need to. From the calm of the Lotus Eaters, the poem shifts to a place where hospitality is replaced by force. Odysseus and his men come to the land of the Cyclopes, whom Homer describes as living without assemblies, law courts, or the ordinary habits of settled Greek life. That difference matters. The Cyclopes are not presented as merely ugly or strange. They are marked by their way of life, and Polyphemus, the Cyclops Odysseus enters, is the clearest example. He is enormous, solitary, and violent, a shepherd who keeps his flocks in a cave rather than in a household. In epic terms, that already signals danger, because a proper ruler is supposed to recognize boundaries, guests, and obligations. Polyphemus recognizes none of them. Odysseus's decision to enter the cave is often treated as a test of judgment as much as a test of strength. He wants to see whether the inhabitants are hospitable, and he also hopes for the kind of gift that guest friendship can bring. Homer has him admit, in effect, that curiosity and greed help lead the men inside. The cave is not a palace. It is a trap. When Polyphemus returns, he does not welcome them or ask their names. He blocks the entrance with a huge stone and begins to seize and eat the men in an act the poem treats as the opposite of civilized conduct. Ancient audiences did not need a philosophical explanation for why this mattered. The whole point is that the Cyclops stands outside the world of reciprocal relationships that make travel possible. In Greek epic, a guest can be vulnerable, but he is supposed to be protected by custom and by Zeus Xenios, the god linked with hospitality. Polyphemus violates that order immediately. The episode also reflects a wider Greek idea about social life. Homer places the Cyclopes outside the practices that define a polis, the community of citizens with shared rules and institutions. They have no public assemblies and no courts, and they do not cultivate the patterned life of neighbors who depend on one another. That does not mean they are a historical people in any direct sense. It means they function as an anti-example. The cave replaces the house, the herd replaces the household, and brute appetite replaces exchange. Later Greek writers and artists would continue to use the Cyclops in that symbolic way as a figure for lawless isolation. Homer's version is the foundation for that later imagination. Odysseus answers with the tools that define him elsewhere: timing, language, and deception. He offers Polyphemus the strong wine he has brought, and the giant drinks enough to weaken himself. The wine matters because the poem treats it as something civil and controlled set against raw physical power. When asked his name, Odysseus says he is nobody, a trick built on the Greek words the poem preserves. Later writers retell the idea in similar ways, but Homer's version is the clearest and most famous. The name is not just a joke, it is a practical weapon. It turns a plea for help into a meaningless complaint, and it lets Odysseus hide his identity at the moment when identity would be most dangerous. Once Polyphemus is asleep, Odysseus and the men drive a sharpened stake into his eye. The escape then depends on restraint as much as force. Odysseus does not fight openly. He has the men cling beneath the bellies of the sheep, as Polyphemus feels the animals pass out of the cave. The disguise works because the Cyclops expects to find men by sight and touch, not hidden under the flock. This part of the story is one of the clearest displays of Odysseus's metis, the practical intelligence that wins through planning rather than direct confrontation. It also shows why Homeric heroism is more than physical courage. Strength alone does not solve every problem in the wandering years after Troy. The cave episode compresses several dangers at once: hunger, confinement, the breakdown of social norms, and the need to improvise under pressure. Odysseus survives by reading the situation correctly and shaping his behavior to fit it. The men survive because he understands the giant's habits well enough to exploit them. That is one reason the scene became so influential in later retellings and in visual art. It gives a compact example of the hero whose success depends on intelligence under strain. The escape, however, does not end as a clean victory. Once outside, Odysseus cannot leave well enough alone. In some readings, his pride looks like a desire to claim credit. In the poem, it is more than that. He calls back to Polyphemus and reveals his real name. That matters because names have weight in Greek heroic culture. To speak one's name is to accept recognition, honor, and the possibility of reputation. Odysseus wants the story of his escape to belong to him. The cost is immediate and lasting. Polyphemus prays to Poseidon, his father in the poem's genealogy, asking that Odysseus either never reach home or do so after losing his companions and suffering long delay. Homer presents the prayer as answered, and later tradition keeps that connection firmly in place. From this point on, Odysseus's journey is no longer only about crossing islands and storms. It becomes a conflict shaped by a god who has taken up the Cyclops' cause. That is why the cave episode stands at the center of the homeward voyage. It is a story about intelligence, but also about the limits of intelligence. In Homer's Odyssey, Poseidon becomes the central divine opponent, not because he was present in the cave, but because the encounter with Polyphemus creates a chain of obligation that the poem treats seriously. Polyphemus is not just a local monster. He is a son of Poseidon, and that family tie gives the blinded Cyclops a god who can hear him, answer him, and turn private injury into lasting punishment. Once Polyphemus prays, the shape of the voyage changes. Odysseus is no longer only a king trying to get home after a war. He is a man moving against the will of one of the sea's ruling powers. In the older Greek world, Poseidon held broad authority over the waters, earthquakes, and the stability of the ground itself. He is not only a storm god in a narrow sense, but a deity whose reach touches travel, arrival, and the safety of human settlements. That matters in a poem about return. Sailors can survive many dangers, but they depend on conditions no crew can fully control. Homer uses Poseidon for exactly that reason. The god's anger makes the sea itself an extension of divine displeasure, and the road home becomes unstable in both physical and moral terms. The movement across the water is no longer neutral geography. Every favorable wind, every delay, and every wrecked ship can be read as part of a larger judgment. The tradition behind this hostility is strongest in the Odyssey itself, but later retellings keep it in place. Ancient summaries and mythographers usually preserve the same basic sequence. Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, boasts of his name, and the Cyclops appeals to his father. What changes from author to author is emphasis. Homer makes the prayer immediate and consequential. Other versions are more interested in how the episode explains the hero's suffering in general. In either case, the cultural point is clear. Greek epic often treated arrogance after success as dangerous, especially when it provoked a god with a long memory. Odysseus has already shown that he can save himself through intelligence. Now the story asks what that intelligence costs when it is joined to pride. That divine hostility also gives structure to the rest of the poem. If Poseidon were angry for only one scene, the episode with the Cyclops would remain a dramatic detour. Instead, the god's opposition becomes one of the main reasons Odysseus is delayed, scattered, and separated from the men who began the voyage with him. The loss is not only nautical, it marks a steady shrinking of Odysseus's world. At Troy, he was one leader among many. On the return sea, he is increasingly isolated, cut off from allies, and forced to survive under conditions that remove support one after another. Poseidon's anger helps explain why the epic feels so extended after the war has already ended. Victory at Troy does not close the story. It begins the part in which the gods demand payment. There is also a practical reason this hostility matters to the poem's structure. The Odyssey is interested in how a person gets home when travel itself becomes uncertain. Poseidon stands at the point where the outside world turns against movement. He can stir waves, delay passages, and make the sea unpredictable enough to break human planning. That is why the god appears less often than some other powers in the poem, yet feels larger than many of them. He does not need constant presence. The threat is built into the voyage once he has chosen an enemy. This is also where Odysseus' character becomes more complicated. He is not punished because he is weak. He is punished because he is effective enough to survive and to speak about his own achievement. The epic admires his intelligence, but it also shows how intelligence can slide into self-exposure. His name, once spoken aloud, becomes part of the mechanism that brings Poseidon into the story in a lasting way. In that sense, the struggle with the sea god is not random divine cruelty. It grows directly out of the hero's own choice to claim credit. The episode also fits a broader pattern in Greek myth, where divine anger often follows a breach of limits rather than a simple act of violence. Odysseus does not merely wound a monster, he enters a space that is not his, outwits its inhabitant, and then names himself at the moment of escape. For a Homeric audience, that final boast matters. In the world of epic, a victory can become unstable the moment it is spoken too loudly. The successful man may want recognition, but recognition can attract retaliation. Poseidon's response makes that principle concrete. The hero's cleverness is real, yet it creates obligations he cannot simply dismiss. That is why the aftermath of the Cyclops episode lasts far beyond the cave itself. The Odyssey repeatedly returns to the cost of the insult, not as a separate moral lesson, but as a governing fact of the journey. Odysseus may outthink enemies, manage storms, and endure hardship, but he cannot step outside the consequences of what he has done. The sea god's anger turns time into something the poem must spend. A homecoming that should have been straightforward becomes prolonged by divine resistance, and the delay is part of the meaning. From there, the poem turns to one of the most familiar tests in Odysseus's journey, the visit to Aeolus, keeper of the winds. In Homer's Odyssey, Aeolus is not an Olympian god in the strict sense, but a powerful figure who rules the winds and lives apart from ordinary human society. He dwells on a floating island, set outside the normal geography of the Greek world. That setting matters, because the episode is not simply about weather. It is about control, hospitality, and the fragile terms on which a homeward voyage can continue. Odysseus is received well given hospitality, and sent away with a favorable wind that should carry him quickly toward Ithaca. Aeolus also gives him a sealed bag containing the other winds, so they will not blow the ships off course. The gift depends entirely on trust. Odysseus must keep the bag sealed, and his crew must accept that what looks like an ordinary bundle is actually the condition of their safe return. The scene is brief, but it gives great weight to a simple arrangement. One man knows what must be preserved, and the others must believe him long enough for the plan to work. The episode belongs to a wider tradition in which winds can be directed, contained, or released by divine or semi-divine figures. Later readers sometimes treat Aeolus as a straightforward god of the winds, but Homer's version is more restrained. He is a ruler with authority over weather, not a major Olympian with a large role in the surrounding mythic cycle. That difference matters because it keeps the focus on the practical problem before Odysseus. He does not receive an easy miracle. He receives a controlled advantage that can be ruined by one mistake. That trust collapses near the end of the voyage. Odysseus has done enough to make the shore seem near, and he finally falls asleep from exhaustion. Homer does not linger on the moment. It is simply the effect of strain. The man who has remained alert through so many dangers is overcome at the worst possible time, and his sleep leaves the ship's safeguard unattended. While he sleeps, the crew begins to suspect that the bag contains treasure or some hidden reward their leader has withheld from them. The suspicion is human, but in the logic of the epic, it is disastrous. They open the bag, the winds burst out, and the fleet is blown back toward the beginning of its path. The poem is severe here because the failure is not caused by a monster or a direct divine attack. It comes from fear, greed, and the inability of the crew to accept that their captain is carrying something they cannot see. In that sense, the bag is more than a container. It is a test of discipline. Odysseus's men have followed him through war and wandering, but they have not learned how to trust the limits of their own knowledge. They know enough to be curious and not enough to resist the urge to open what has been set apart from them. Their mistake is small in physical terms and enormous in consequence. Ancient readers would have recognized the pattern. A hero may be clever, but he still depends on the obedience of others. Odysseus can plan, negotiate, and endure, but he cannot force trust into his men. The epic has already shown this problem elsewhere, especially where the crew ignores warning or fails to restrain appetite. Here the failure is narrower and more pointed. The men do not rebel in open anger, they act from misreading, and that misreading becomes its own kind of destruction. Aeolus has helped, but the help is not enough to overcome suspicion once it takes hold. The men have already lost confidence, and the journey collapses just as Ithaca seemed close. There is also a practical reason the episode has remained so memorable. Wind in seafaring life was never abstract. A favorable wind could make the difference between a short crossing and a ruined passage. A hostile wind could trap ships, scatter them, or drive them into unfamiliar water. Homer uses that reality with precision. Aeolus does not merely offer goodwill, he gives a navigational advantage that should have solved the hardest part of the return. When the bag is opened, that advantage is instantly reversed. The ships are not damaged in battle, they are displaced, which is a different kind of disaster for a return narrative. The men lose not only distance but orientation. Some later summaries treat Aeolus more simply as a wind giver, but Homer's version matters because it places the disaster inside the household of the ship itself. The crew is not defeated by an outside army, it defeats its own chance of safety. That is why the episode feels smaller than the battles at Troy, and yet more important for the homeward story. It shows that the road back is vulnerable at every level, even after divine aid has been granted. Favorable winds are not the same as arrival. A gift can only work if it is guarded, and the epic is careful to show how easily a gift becomes ruin when fear enters the group. When the ships are blown away from Ithaca, the poem makes the setback feel almost final, though not quite final enough to end the journey. From there, the surviving ships reach the land of the Laestrygonians, a people Homer describes as giants and cannibals. The poem offers only a brief geographic frame, and later writers placed them in different parts of the Western Mediterranean. In the epic itself, though, they matter less as a fixed location than as a sudden measure of how exposed the Greeks have become. After the quarrel over Aeolus's gift, Odysseus still has a fleet. After the Laestrygonians, almost all of it is gone. The Greeks first come in by scouting. Odysseus does not anchor everyone at once. He sends one ship ahead to look for people and a place to take water. That detail matters because it shows the practical habits that have kept him alive this far. He is still acting as a captain who needs information before committing his whole force. The scouts find a landscape that seems ordinary at first, a harbour, a road inland, and a daughter of the king drawing water. The stranger they meet is not immediately hostile. She leads them toward her father's house. Only then does the danger become clear. The king, Antiphates, behaves like a ruler of a savage people, and once his intentions are revealed, the city becomes a trap. Homer's account is swift and economical. Antiphates kills one of the men, and the alarm goes out. The Laestrygonians do not fight as a disciplined army on open ground. They attack from the heights, hurling huge rocks down into the harbour and smashing the ships where they sit packed together. That arrangement is crucial. The Greek vessels are vulnerable because the harbour is enclosed. There is no room to maneuver. In earlier episodes, Odysseus's danger often comes from a single creature or a single choice. Here it comes from geography itself, from a harbour that turns against the fleet once the exit is blocked. The image fits the poem's wider habit of making failed hospitality into disaster. The Greeks enter a place that ought to offer water, rest, and exchange. Instead, the harbour becomes a killing ground. Homer often treats guest friendship as a measure of civilization, and here those rules collapse completely. The strangers are not merely refused shelter, they are hunted after accepting an invitation inward. That is why the episode lands so sharply. It is not a battle between equal forces. It is a betrayal of the conditions that make safe contact possible. Only Odysseus's own ship escapes, and even that escape depends on the fact that he had kept his vessel outside the main killing zone. The poem makes him a survivor not because he wins, but because he was not caught in the worst of the trap. That is one reason the episode feels so severe. The expedition is not simply punished for arrogance or greed, it is reduced by circumstance. Its numbers shrink in a moment, and with them, the scale of the whole return journey. The speed of the destruction also matters. Homer does not linger over a siege or a heroic stand. The fleet is ruined almost as soon as the threat becomes visible. The men on shore have no time to regroup, and those in the harbour cannot escape the stones falling from above. In that sense, the Laestrygonians mark a change in the poem's pattern of danger. Earlier, Odysseus can still argue, plan, or endure long enough for events to unfold. Here the action closes before strategy can matter. A bad landing becomes a catastrophe, and a mistake in judgment turns into sheer loss. In the larger pattern of the Odyssey, this is one of the clearest examples of how homecoming is not a single road, but a series of narrowing possibilities. Odysseus began with ships, men, and the status of a returning king. Now he is drifting towards solitude. The fleet that sailed from Troy has been steadily undone, first by war, then by human error, then by the violence of places that cannot be reasoned with. The Laestrygonians are especially important because they show that even after a warning from the gods, even after one miraculous escape, there is still no guarantee that the next shoreline will be survivable. The episode also helps explain why the Odyssey can feel so harsh in its middle books. Each loss prepares the next stage of the journey by stripping away protections. A fleet is not just military power, it is labor, food storage, companionship, and the practical means of staying alive at sea. When almost all of it is destroyed, the story changes in kind. Odysseus can no longer move as the leader of many men. He becomes a man whose survival depends on one remaining ship, and eventually on much less than that. The Laestrygonians are not a side note between larger adventures. They are a threshold. After them, the return to Ithaca is no longer the return of an expedition, it is the long diminished passage of one survivor. The next stop in the poem is Circe's island, and the change in atmosphere is sharp. After the destruction of the fleet and the near-total loss of his men, Odysseus reaches a place dangerous in a different way. The threat is not open violence but enchantment, confusion, and the slow loss of self. In the Odyssey, Circe is a powerful woman living apart from ordinary human society. Later tradition often makes her into a sorceress, and that is the familiar image today, but in Homer, she is also a host. She receives the strangers, offers them food, and moves between welcome and danger in a way that makes the episode unsettling. That matters because hospitality in Greek epic is never a minor detail. A household that feeds guests is supposed to protect them. On Circe's island, that expectation becomes unstable. The first sign that something is wrong comes when Circe transforms Odysseus's crew into swine after they enter her hall. Homer presents the change as magic, not as a disguise or a symbolic insult alone. The men remain aware in some form, which makes the loss even more disturbing. They are trapped inside another shape, unable to recover themselves. This is one of the poem's clearest reminders that the journey home can be broken not only by shipwreck and storm, but by the failure to recognize what one is walking into. It also shows how seriously the epic treats bodily vulnerability. In this world, a person's form is not secure simply because it is human. A divine or semi-divine power can undo that stability at once. Odysseus does not rush in blindly after them. In Homer's version, he is warned before he reaches the house. Hermes appears and gives him the plant called moly, a gift that protects him from Circe's drugged potion and allows him to face her without being transformed. The detail belongs to the epic's divine structure. Odysseus still has to act for himself, but he is not acting alone. The gods help, yet their help is selective. They do not remove the danger, they make survival possible. The moly episode is important because it marks Odysseus as a man who can receive divine assistance without becoming passive. He is equipped, not rescued. He still has to enter the house, resist Circe, and speak for his men. What follows combines force, restraint, and negotiation. Odysseus draws his sword when Circe tries to harm him, but the encounter does not end in simple combat. Once her spell fails against him, the balance changes. Circe becomes a figure of controlled power rather than unchecked threat, and the relationship turns toward agreement. In Homer, she swears not to trick him further and restores his companions. This is one of several places in the poem where hospitality is tested at its edge. A house can shelter strangers or consume them, and the difference often depends on recognition, divine aid, and self-command. The island exposes the rules of the household instead of simply following them. Welcome is still present, but it has to be negotiated against danger. Later retellings sometimes sharpen Circe into a more purely seductive figure, and that element is already present in the Odyssey. But the poem is more complicated than a simple story of temptation. Odysseus stays on her island for a year, and the pause matters. The man who has been reduced to surviving day by day is given rest, food, and time to recover his bearings. Circe becomes, for a time, a source of practical guidance. She is the one who tells him that he must descend to the Underworld if he wants direction for the rest of the voyage. That instruction turns the island into a turning point. It is not only a place of danger, it is also a place where the journey gains its next shape. In narrative terms, the island interrupts the return, but it also supplies the knowledge that will make the rest of the return possible. The year-long stay also helps explain why the episode remained important in later Greek and Roman literature. A pause of that length is not just a delay in travel, it is a reversal of expectation. Odysseus is a man defined by motion, loss, and planning, yet here he is forced into stillness. The epic suggests that endurance is sometimes as necessary as action. It also shows that memory and desire can become dangerous when a traveler is cut off from the ordinary structures of home. Circe's island offers food, companionship, and safety from immediate pursuit, but those comforts do not erase the larger problem of homecoming. They only postpone it until Odysseus is ready to seek knowledge beyond the world of the living. Some ancient summaries and later authors emphasize the erotic side of the episode more strongly than Homer does. Others focus on Circe as a divine or semi-divine helper linked to older traditions of magic, herbal knowledge, and liminal spaces between wilderness and settlement. Those layers matter because they show how flexible the story became. Circe can be read as a threat to male discipline, a test of cunning, or a necessary guide at the moment when ordinary travel has failed. What stays constant is that she interrupts the collapse. After the loss of nearly all the fleet, she gives Odysseus a pause, restores a measure of order, and tells him that the road home still runs through knowledge he does not yet have. The story also reflects wider Greek ideas about women, strangers, and dangerous expertise. Circe is not merely a monster outside civilization. She is a figure who knows things ordinary men do not, especially about bodies, drugs, and transformation. That is one reason the episode remained so adaptable in later retellings. So this chapter does not simply add another obstacle, it changes the terms of the journey. From Circe's island, Odysseus is sent not to another shore, but to a place no living hero is meant to reach and return from unchanged. In Homer's Odyssey, this journey is called the Nikuia, the rite of consulting the dead. It is not a conquest of the underworld and not a rescue mission. Odysseus goes because Circe tells him that only the shade of the Theban seer Tiresias can explain how he may get home and what dangers still wait for him on the way. The dead are not a backdrop here. They are a source of knowledge the living cannot obtain any other way. Before he leaves, Circe gives Odysseus instructions for the approach, the sacrifice, and the order in which the shades will come. In Homer, he sails to the edge of ocean, the far boundary the poem imagines, and there performs the rites. Later Greek and Roman retellings often make the descent more literal, with a fuller geography of the underworld. Homer is more restrained. He gives a borderland, a dark opening, and a ritual that allows voices to answer. The scene is not a guided tour of hell. It is a dangerous consultation, dependent on correct ritual and careful speech. The first and most important figure to appear is Tiresias. In the poem, he remains distinct among the dead, because Persephone has given him mind and awareness after death. That is a special privilege, not a general rule. Most shades in the scene are pale, confused, and in need of blood before they can speak clearly. Tiresias alone comes forward with authority. He tells Odysseus that Poseidon still bears him ill will because of the blinding of Polyphemus. He also gives the central warning of the homeward voyage. If Odysseus and his men keep discipline and do not harm the cattle of Helios, he may yet return. If they fail, the ship and crew will be lost. The poem places the burden of choice inside that warning. Fate is present, but survival still depends on conduct. That is one reason the underworld scene has remained so influential. It does not simply reveal the ending, it gives conditions. Odysseus learns that his return is possible, but not easy, and not innocent. Knowledge does not cancel suffering. It only clarifies where suffering will come from and what mistakes will make it worse. In that sense, the Nikuia works almost like a reversal of ordinary epic triumph. The hero is not being praised for overcoming the unknown by force. He is being told that survival depends on hearing, remembering, and obeying. The dead do not flatter him, they instruct him. After Tiresias, Odysseus sees his mother, Anticlea. Her presence is one of the most human moments in the epic. She tells him what has happened in Ithaca while he has been away, and Odysseus learns that she died not from violence in battle, but from longing and grief over his absence, at least in the poem's emotional logic. Ancient readers were drawn to this passage because it gives the return journey its deepest cost. Home is not just delayed, it has changed in his absence. Odysseus tries to embrace her 3 times and fails each time, because the dead are no longer made of the same substance as the living. Homer does not linger on doctrine here, he lingers on separation. The poem also uses Anticlea to widen the meaning of Odysseus' homecoming. His journey has often been framed as a series of external tests, but this encounter shows that time itself has been working against him. The household in Ithaca has not remained frozen. People have aged, died, and suffered in his absence. That matters because the Odyssey is not only about whether he will survive the sea, it is about whether he can return to a home that has already been altered by waiting. The underworld gives him information, but it also gives him a measure of loss that cannot be repaired by knowledge. Other shades follow, and later traditions expand the list. There is Agamemnon, whose story becomes a warning about treachery at home. There is Achilles, who famously says he would rather live as a poor servant than rule over all the dead, a line that sharply undercuts the heroic idea that glory can compensate for mortality. The poem also includes other figures from the Trojan past, widening the scene into a review of the war's human cost. In some later summaries, the order and emphasis shift. Some authors make the underworld more structured, some more moralized, some more vividly populated, but the core remains stable. The dead answer the living only briefly, and their answers are shaped by loss. The encounter with Agamemnon has its own literary force because it reflects one of the poem's recurring concerns, the danger that waits not only in foreign places, but inside the household itself. Odysseus has been warned repeatedly about disorder at home, and Agamemnon's shade confirms that the end of a war does not guarantee safe return. Achilles, by contrast, gives the scene a larger heroic correction. In the older martial logic of fame, the greatest warrior should possess the greatest honor after death. Achilles rejects that idea by speaking from among the dead as one who has seen the cost of such glory. Homer does not make him philosophical in a later abstract sense. He makes him blunt. Even the most celebrated life has a shadow if it ends in the underworld. The Nekuia also shows how old and flexible the story is. Scholars generally treat Homer's version as the best surviving early witness, but not the only traditional form. Greek religion knew many ways of approaching the dead, from hero cults to local underworld oracles, and the epic draws on that broader ritual world without reducing it to one fixed theology. That is why the scene feels both particular and unsettled. It belongs to the poem, yet it also carries traces of older practices in which the dead were consulted for guidance, warning, or remembrance. In later Greek thought and in Roman adaptation, especially in works like Virgil's Aeneid, the underworld becomes more organized and more visibly moralized. Homer's version remains more immediate and less systematized. It is concerned with right, voice, and recognition. There is also a practical reason the episode matters in the structure of the Odyssey. Up to this point, Odysseus has often depended on improvisation. He escapes by trick, disguise, and opportunistic endurance. Here, however, he is given a formal directive. The future homeward route is not left to guesswork. The seer's instructions anticipate later episodes of the poem, especially the encounter with Helios's cattle and the final loss of the crew. In that way, the Nicaea functions as a hinge in the narrative. It gathers up what has happened, explains what it means, and points toward the disasters still to come. The journey is no longer a chain of adventures with no visible shape. From the underworld, the road home grows narrower and more dangerous. In Homer's Odyssey, Circe warns Odysseus that he must pass the Sirens, then the cliffs of Scylla, and then the whirlpool of Charybdis. These are not just three monsters placed one after another. They represent three kinds of danger at sea: temptation, unavoidable loss, and waters no skill can fully master. The voyage becomes a sequence of choices, and each one carries a cost. The Sirens come first. In Homer, their danger is not force, but knowledge offered in the wrong form. They sing to sailors and promise to tell them everything that happened at Troy and everything that will happen afterward. That detail matters. They are not tempting Odysseus with food or comfort. They offer total understanding, and they offer it in a way that would make moving on seem unnecessary. Circe tells Odysseus to block his crew's ears with wax and to have himself tied to the mast if he wants to hear the song without yielding to it. This becomes one of the clearest moments in the epic, where restraint is a heroic skill. Odysseus does not defeat the Sirens by strength. He survives them by admitting in advance that he cannot trust himself once he hears them. Later readers have often treated the Sirens as symbols of dangerous pleasure, but the poem is more exact than that. Their song is persuasive because it sounds like complete knowledge. Odysseus wants to hear it, and the solution that saves him depends on accepting limitation as part of intelligence. He remains conscious, unlike his crew, but his freedom is narrowed so the ship can continue. The scene suggests that wisdom may require choosing the condition in which one can still survive one's own desire. In a poem so concerned with return, that is a severe discipline. Odysseus must remain himself, but not entirely on his own terms. The Sirens also belong to a wider pattern in Greek myth. Later art often imagines them with birds' bodies and women's faces, though the oldest literary descriptions are less elaborate. Their place in the journey matters as much as their appearance. They stand between Troy and home, between memory and future knowledge, in a space where a traveler might stop moving if perfect explanation became too tempting. Their song does not simply entertain. It offers stasis, and for a voyage defined by motion, that is its threat. After the Sirens, the poem brings Odysseus to an even harsher passage. He must choose between Scylla, a many-headed sea monster in a cliffside cave, and Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallows the water itself. Circe tells him not to try to fight both. He should steer close to Scylla because Charybdis could destroy everyone. This is one of the epic's hardest lessons. The right choice is not safety. It is the least destructive option among disasters. Scylla takes 6 men, and the poem is direct about the loss. Odysseus cannot save them. He can only decide where the ship will be lost and keep the rest of the crew alive. The force of the scene comes partly from its geography. The narrow strait is not just a setting, but a trap. A ship cannot pass through it without exposing itself to one danger or the other. That is why the passage has lasted so strongly in seafaring imagination. Ancient readers linked it to the Strait of Messina between Sicily and mainland Italy, though Homer presents the place in legendary terms rather than as a chartable location. Whether or not the setting reflects a real crossing, the logic is exact. In a tight channel, avoidance can become impossible, and navigation becomes a matter of choosing damage rather than preventing it. Later traditions sometimes expanded these figures. Ancient commentators and poets occasionally gave Scylla different origins, and Charybdis could be treated more like a personified force than a fixed monster. But Homer's version is the most influential surviving account, and it is stark in what it refuses to soften. Odysseus is warned in advance that not everyone will make it through. The heroism lies in continuing anyway. In that sense, These episodes fit the larger structure of the journey after the Underworld. Tiresias has already told him that he cannot bring all of his men home. The sea now makes that warning concrete. The passage of Scylla and Charybdis also preserves a quiet difference between knowledge and power. Odysseus receives Circe's warning, and that warning helps him, but it does not give him mastery. He knows what will happen, yet he still cannot make the crossing harmless. Homer often works this way. Foreknowledge does not remove loss, it only changes whether the loss comes with confusion or recognition. That is why the scene is so severe. Odysseus is not surprised, but he is not saved either. This is also where his role in the poem becomes especially complex. He is clever, but cleverness does not always mean control. It can mean seeing the limits of control more clearly than others do. The Sirens can be managed only by binding himself. Scylla can be avoided only by accepting casualties. Charybdis can be escaped only by not giving it the chance to take the ship. The epic does not present these as abstract lessons. They are practical decisions made in sequence, under pressure, with lives at stake. In Homer's hands, intelligence is inseparable from endurance, and endurance is inseparable from injury. Some later retellings separate the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis into distinct adventures, but in Homer they function as a single test of judgment. Each danger asks a different question. Can you resist what is enticing? Can you choose between losses without pretending the choice is fair? Can you keep moving when every path costs something? Odysseus answers by surviving, but not by saving everyone. The poem does not hide that fact. It makes the cost part of the wisdom. That is why these scenes have lasted. The next stop in the poem is not as strange as the land of the Cyclops or the Sirens, but it is just as important because it turns the voyage from a series of hard choices into a moral failure. Odysseus reaches Thrinacia, the island where Helios keeps his cattle and sheep. In Homer's Odyssey, the warning has already been given. Tiresias and Circe both tell him not to harm the herds, because the sun god protects them and because the crew's survival depends on restraint. That detail matters. The men are not ruined by ignorance alone. They are ruined after being told clearly what must not be done. The episode also fits the larger pattern of the poem. Odysseus has learned how to face danger, but he cannot fully govern the people under him. On the open sea, leadership is never only a matter of intelligence, it is also a matter of discipline, persuasion, and limits that have to hold under pressure. Thrinacia shows what happens when those limits fail. In the Odyssey, bad weather traps the crew on the island. They are stranded, hungry, and unable to sail away. The poem lets that pressure build for many days, and the delay weakens judgment. Odysseus goes away to pray or to move farther inland, and while he is absent, the men decide to kill and eat the cattle. In some versions of the tradition, starvation is the main cause. In Homer, the hunger is real, but it does not excuse the act. The cattle belong to Helios, and the men know they are forbidden. Eurylochus, who has already been one of the more doubtful members of the crew, helps push the decision. The violation becomes collective, not accidental. Ancient audiences would have recognized how serious that sacrilege is. Greek myth often treats sacred animals and sacred places as boundaries where hunger, impatience, or pride are tested against divine order. Helios's cattle are not just livestock, they are signs of a god's property and authority. To touch them is to cross a line that should have been clear from the beginning. The poem is careful about this. The crew's mistake is not simply weakness in the abstract, but the choice to let immediate need overrule a warning from the gods. That pattern matters for the rest of the journey. The punishment comes quickly after the offense. Helios complains to Zeus, and Zeus grants the demand that the act not go unanswered. In Homer, that chain matters because it shows the gods acting through appeal and authority rather than through random violence. Helios does not simply take revenge on his own. He brings the matter to Zeus, who stands above the dispute and authorizes the response. When Odysseus and the others leave the island, a storm breaks their ship. In Homer's account, the ship is destroyed and the companions are lost. Only Odysseus survives, and he survives because he had not taken part in the meal. The poem makes that distinction plain. He is not innocent of every failure in the larger voyage, but at this point he is separate from the final crime. The scene also closes the distance between warning and consequence. Earlier disasters often come from monsters, storms, or unclear routes, where danger is external and the path is hard to see. Thrinacia is different because the terms are explicit. Tiresias speaks in the Underworld. Circe repeats the warning, and Odysseus passes it on. The crew cannot claim that no one told them. In that sense, the episode belongs to a recurring Greek concern with knowing the right course and still failing to hold to it when pressure rises. Hunger is real, but the poem does not treat need as a full defense against violation. That tension gives the episode its force. This ending is one of the starkest in the Odyssey because it strips away almost everything left of the expedition. The crew that sailed from Troy has already been reduced again and again. By the time they reach Thrinacia, there is very little left to lose. The cattle episode removes the remainder. It is not a battle scene, and it is not a test of strength. It is the collapse of shared restraint, followed by a divine response that cannot be negotiated away. That is also why the episode stayed central in later readings of the poem. It is one of the clearest places where Homer links survival with obedience, not simply with cleverness. Odysseus is famous for intelligence, but intelligence alone does not keep a crew together. A leader can know the danger and still fail if his men cannot endure the final limit. Eurylochus matters here. He is not a villain in the broad mythic sense, but he becomes the voice of desperation that pushes the others past the boundary. The poem treats that as a social failure as much as an individual one. Once the group decides to violate the warning, the disaster belongs to all of them. Later retellings sometimes soften or rearrange this part of the story, but the Homeric version is severe in a precise way. The gods do not punish Odysseus for every disaster around him, nor do they punish the men for mere survival. They punish a known prohibition that the crew chose to ignore. That is why the episode sits so well beside the earlier dangers of the voyage. The Sirens tested attention. From the wreckage of the ship and the loss of the last companions, the story turns to one of the most isolated places in Odysseus's voyage. In Homer's Odyssey, that place is Ogygia, the island of Calypso, where Odysseus is kept for years. The poem presents it as remote and cut off from ordinary travel, beyond the routes of kings and merchants. Later tradition often calls Calypso a nymph, but Homer gives her a divine status without fixing her into a single later category. The point is not only that Odysseus is stranded, but that he is removed from human society altogether. Rescue no longer lies within normal reach, and the isolation becomes part of the trial. The island matters because it represents a different kind of divine power from the threats Odysseus has already faced. On earlier islands, gods, monsters, and hostile figures have endangered his life directly. Ogygia is different. Calypso's island is abundant, ordered and enclosed with groves, springs and vines under a goddess's care. Homer's description is deliberate. The plenty of the island shows that Odysseus's problem is no longer hunger or shipwreck, but separation from the world that gives human life its place. He is safe, yet displaced. That tension shapes the whole episode. It also changes the meaning of the return. Before this, Odysseus has been tested by violence, temptation, storms, and the failures of his crew. On Calypso's island, those pressures recede. He is given shelter, food, and comfort. The danger is harder to see, but no less serious. In the Odyssey, Calypso keeps him against his will and offers him what no mortal can fully have. She promises immortality and everlasting youth if he stays. The offer is not simple cruelty. It is a choice between conditions that cannot be joined. Odysseus can remain in safety and gain something beyond the human lot, or he can leave and continue toward Ithaca where age, loss, and recognition await him. Homer makes the choice grave because neither path is free. Some later retellings soften the episode or make Calypso more romantic, but the Odyssey keeps its tension clear. Odysseus does not belong on the island. He spends his days on the shore, weeping and looking out over the sea. The hero known for motion is reduced to waiting. He cannot simply force his way home. He can only endure, and endurance becomes the center of the scene. Calypso's island is not a reward after suffering, but a suspension of return. Time continues there, but the journey does not for Homer's audience. That delay would have mattered because a returning man was meant to restore order to a household and a community. Here, that restoration is withheld. The gods remain involved, but in a different way. Athena still favors Odysseus, and Zeus sends Hermes to tell Calypso that she must let him go. The release does not come from Odysseus's own strength. Homer is careful about that. He has survived through intelligence and patience many times, but here the turning point depends on divine instruction. The balance of power is plain. Calypso can offer comfort, but she cannot finally keep a mortal man from his fate once Zeus has spoken. At the same time, the episode shows how limited divine gifts can be. Immortality is offered as an alternative to homecoming, not as a solution to it. Odysseus must choose between two kinds of loss. One path denies Ithaca, the other restores it at the cost of everything immortality would mean. The poem does not say he is wrong to choose mortality. It treats that choice as part of being human. This is why the chapter belongs after the catastrophe on Thrinacia. Odysseus has already lost the last of his companions, and now the journey narrows to a single life held in delay. Homer does not rush this part. He lets the loneliness settle. When Zeus sends Hermes to Calypso, the logic of the story changes, even if Odysseus's condition does not improve at once. The The messenger does not bring comfort or compromise. He carries a command from above. Calypso must let the hero go. In Homer's poem, she resists at first in speech. She understands the imbalance. A goddess on a remote island can keep a mortal visitor for years, but she cannot defy Zeus once his will has been stated clearly. The scene matters because it shows that Odysseus's delay is not simply bad luck. In the epic's world, the return home is being worked out among divine powers, and they are not all on the same side. That idea is central to the Odyssey as a whole. Odysseus does not drift through random episodes without pattern. Again and again, outside powers shape the journey. Athena has already helped him. Poseidon has already opposed him. Zeus, less active in many scenes than either of them, remains the authority who can settle the larger dispute. When Hermes delivers the order to Calypso, the poem makes clear that even immortals live within a hierarchy. Calypso may delay Odysseus, but she cannot keep him once the highest divine will has turned against that delay. Her island has already been a place of suspension. It offered food, shelter, and the chance to forget the war and the losses that followed it. Homer presents Calypso as powerful and separate from ordinary life, and that separation gives the island its character. It is not Ithaca, not Troy, and not a kingdom with public obligations. It is a secluded place where time can seem stalled. But it has also held Odysseus in a condition that was never meant to be permanent. The poem is careful on this point. The comfort is real, and so is the danger of comfort. A mortal may be fed, warmed, and protected, while still being cut off from the duties that define him. Odysseus has been sheltered there, but shelter has become delay in his identity as husband, king, and returning man. Once Hermes leaves, Calypso helps him build a raft. In Homer, this is not a rescue by the gods so much as a release into the sea with only what he needs to survive. She gives him wood, provisions, and practical instruction. He is not carried home. He must face the open water again, this time alone. That fits the poem's larger habit of making Odysseus earn every stage of his return. Even when a god's order frees him, the freedom is narrow and costly. The raft is a human-scale answer in a world ruled by powers larger than humans can control. The episode also presents Calypso in a more complicated light than a simple captor. In Homer, she complains that male gods are free to take mortal women as they please, while her own bond with Odysseus is condemned. The poem does not resolve that complaint, but it leaves room for it. That matters because it shows that the tradition remembered Calypso not only as a force of delay, but as a figure with her own grievance. Later readers often turned her into a symbol of romantic confinement, but the poem keeps the exchange sharper and less even. She can resist in words, but not in outcome. She can assist Odysseus, but only after giving up the claim she has held over him. That detail belongs to Odysseus's larger character throughout the epic. He is not the kind of hero whose strength solves everything at once. He survives by adaptation, and the raft is one more example of that. It is small compared with the ships that sailed to Troy, and smaller still beside the sea that now lies between him and Ithaca. The poem stresses the danger of the voyage. A raft is not an emblem of triumph. It is a temporary means of beginning the return, not a way of controlling it. Odysseus can leave the island, but he cannot command the route. He can prepare, but he cannot guarantee arrival. What follows is shaped by Poseidon, whose hostility has been growing since the Cyclops episode. In the Odyssey, Poseidon is the god most responsible for the suffering that follows, though later summaries and local traditions sometimes spread the blame across a wider circle of divine resentment. In Homer, Poseidon sees Odysseus on the raft and sends a storm against him. The sea rises, the craft breaks apart, and the hero is again reduced to survival. He is not punished for one isolated mistake. He is caught in the consequences of an earlier offense, and the poem shows how divine anger can remain active for a very long time. That is one reason the story has such a long middle. The voyage is not only distance, but consequence. The storm also shows how fragile the release from Calypso really was. Odysseus has been freed, but he has not yet entered a stable human world. He is suspended between divine permission and divine punishment. The poem lingers on this because it is one of its central ideas. A man may move from one danger to another without any clean break between them. Even leaving one island does not mean reaching safety. Odysseus leaves one enclosure only to enter a more hostile element. The sea itself becomes the place where that transition is tested. This storm is one of the last trials of the journey's first long phase. Odysseus has already lost his men, his ships, and any illusion that endurance alone will carry him home. Now even the final vessel he has built with his own hands is taken away. He is left with divine help in one place and divine hostility in another. That is what makes this chapter a turning point. It does not bring him to Ithaca, but it clears away the remaining hope that the road home will be easy once Calypso lets him go. In the epic's logic, freedom is not the same as safety. The return is now possible, but only after another collapse. The sea struggle ends with arrival in a different part of the Greek world, the land of the Phaeacians. Here too, the tradition matters. In Homer, the Phaeacians are a people set apart, skilled in sailing and inclined toward hospitality. They are not just a stop on a map. They are a civilized shore where a stranger can be received before the final passage home. The poem places them at a distance from ordinary mortals, and that distance serves the narrative. They are the last community Odysseus reaches before Ithaca, and they can do what others in the story have failed to do: receive him, listen to him, and help him cross the final stretch. Later retellings sometimes emphasize their almost fairy tale separation from the rest of the world, but the poem uses them to bridge two conditions: the abandoned exile and the restored king. Odysseus reaches their land exhausted, stripped down by the storm and barely holding on. That exhaustion matters. He does not arrive as a conquering figure. He reaches safety only after being broken by the sea. The poem has been consistent about this from the start. His return is never simple progress. It is made of rescue, setback, and renewed dependence. The Phaeacian episode also changes the kind of help Odysseus receives. With Calypso, assistance is involuntary and limited. With the Phaeacians, hospitality becomes a social order. They offer rest, conversation, and transport. In the Greek world reflected by the poem, xenia, or guest friendship, is a serious cultural expectation. The Phaeacians embody that ideal more fully than many other groups in the story. They can recognize a stranger and respond with formal generosity. Among the Phaeacians, Odysseus is giving what he has lacked for most of the voyage, a place where speech matters again. In Homer's Odyssey, this people are known for their ships, their speed at sea, and their custom of receiving strangers before asking their names. That is not incidental. The poem treats hospitality as a social test, and the Phaeacians pass it in a way that sharply contrasts with the dangers Odysseus has already met. He washes ashore on the condition that follows shipwreck and divine pressure, weakened, salt-stung, and unsure whether the next encounter will help him or destroy him. The first thing that matters is not combat, but courtesy. Nausicaa, the princess who finds him, and then her parents, Alcinous and Arete, show the kind of generosity Greek tradition associates with civilized order. They feed him, clothe him, and listen before they judge. The setting also matters because it creates a pause before the end of the journey. The Phaeacians are not another enemy people to overcome. They stand outside the ordinary cycle of war that has already consumed so much of Odysseus's life. In later tradition, they could be imagined as almost an idealized people, but in Homer, they serve a more exact narrative purpose. They are the final intermediary between exile and return. Their island is where the wandering king can become a storyteller before he becomes a homecoming figure again. That shift is central to the epic's shape. Odysseus does not simply survive by force. He survives long enough to explain himself. The poem is careful about how this welcome begins. Nausicaa is sent with her attendants to wash clothes at the river, a practical errand that fits the domestic world the Phaeacians inhabit. Odysseus, hidden and exhausted, approaches her cautiously. He does not seize the moment or demand aid. He speaks as a suppliant, asking for clothing and safe passage, and he frames himself in terms that would make sense in Greek social life. He is a stranger in need, not a threat to be killed outright. Nausicaa, though young, responds with restraint and intelligence. She gives him what he needs, tells him how to approach the house, and warns him to seek her mother first. That advice matters because the queen, Arete, is not decorative. In the poem, she holds unusual authority, and the house will not receive Odysseus properly unless she is satisfied. The result is a household governed by recognition, obligation, and order rather than fear. When Odysseus enters the hall, the poem places him in a setting that resembles an ideal court, but one still anchored in human custom. He receives food, a seat, and the chance to speak after he has been properly prepared. The Phaeacians' courtesy is not abstract kindness. It is a social practice with rules, and those rules distinguish them from the places where Odysseus has recently been trapped or nearly killed. The Lotus Eaters blur memory. Polyphemus rejects the laws of guest friendship. Circe and Calypso delay departure through enchantment and desire. By comparison, the Phaeacians restore the sequence that makes travel meaningful. Strangers arrive, hosts inquire, gifts are exchanged, and the way back is opened. When he tells his story, the poem folds back over itself. The great journey the audience has been following is now recounted by Odysseus inside the poem to the Phaeacian court. This is one of the clearest examples of how the Odyssey preserves more than one layer of tradition at once. The external narrator presents the frame, while Odysseus gives the inner account of his wanderings. The result is not mere repetition, it gives the tale authority and distance. The sufferings on the way from Troy to this shore become a remembered sequence, ordered by the hero who lived them. At the same time, the frame reminds the audience that this is still a received story, shaped by performance and not a fixed written record from a single moment in antiquity. Homer's poem is the fullest surviving version, but it stands beside older oral storytelling and later summaries that sometimes rearrange details or emphasize different episodes. Odysseus begins where the voyage truly turned away from home, and then he moves through the losses one by one. In the Phaeacian hall, he tells of hostile shores, monsters, enchantments, divine interference, and the gradual destruction of his crew. The sequence matters because it shows what kind of hero he is in Greek tradition. He is not the strongest warrior in the field, and the poem does not ask him to be. He is the man who can endure, choose, misjudge, recover, and adapt. Each episode reveals a different form of danger and a different form of intelligence. Some threats are physical, some are moral, and some are rooted in the god's anger. By recounting them in order, Odysseus turns scattered survival into a coherent path. The Phaeacians listen because their world is one where memory can still be transmitted cleanly. They are moved by the tale, and their response leads to the practical gift that matters most at this stage: passage home. In Homer, they provide Odysseus with a ship and crew that can carry him to Ithaca while he sleeps. That detail is small, but it closes the long movement of the epic in a way that fits their role. They do not conquer the distance, they bridge it. Divine and human aid work together here. The gods have been shaping the journey from the start, sometimes with hostility and sometimes with protection, but the last stretch depends on mortal hospitality as well. A stranger is received, a tale is heard, and a king is ferried home. The gift of transport also reflects the special reputation the poem gives the Phaeacians as sailors. They are not described as traders in the ordinary sense, and the text does not dwell on commerce. Instead, it emphasizes swiftness and technical mastery. Their ships move with uncanny ease, and their navigation seems almost effortless compared with the hard labor and uncertainty of other Greek voyages in epic tradition. That reputation has a function within the story. It marks them as a people who can cross the border between the human world and the uncertain sea without being destroyed by it. For Odysseus, who has repeatedly been lost at that border, their skill is exactly what is needed. They are the last people who can place him back in the geography of home. Later retellings sometimes give the Phaeacian episode a more finished or enchanted quality, as if their island belongs almost outside ordinary geography. The Odyssey itself is more restrained. It uses them to solve a problem of narrative and return. Odysseus has to be brought back from the edge of the world, but he also has to be restored to human society before he can reclaim his household. The Phaeacians make that transition possible. They turn the wanderer into a guest, then into a passenger, and finally into a man on the threshold of home. There is also a meaningful contrast between the public honor Odysseus receives here and the secrecy that will follow after he reaches Ithaca. Among the Phaeacians, he speaks openly under royal protection. When Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca in Homer's Odyssey, the homecoming is not immediate. It has to be earned through recognition, restraint, and testing. That delay matters, because the epic does not treat return as a simple arrival. A man can come back to his island and still remain unknown in his own house. He can stand in his hall as a beggar before he is accepted as king. The final movement of the poem turns on that tension. Athena gives Odysseus the disguise of an old beggar, and in the poem this is one of the clearest signs of her protection. The disguise lets him move through Ithaca without being challenged at once, but it also fits the larger pattern of the character himself. Odysseus is never only the strongest man in the room, he is the one who can alter his appearance, bend language, and wait for the right moment. In the Homeric version, that skill is not a trick for its own sake. It is the means by which order can be restored in a house overtaken by disorder. It also lets the poem stage a slow return to authority. Before Odysseus can punish anyone, he has to learn the condition of his own land, and the beggar's body gives him access to information that a returning king in full splendor might not obtain so easily. He first goes to the hut of Eumaeus, the swineherd, who receives him generously before knowing who he is. That scene is important because Homer makes hospitality a moral test. Eumaeus is poor, but he still behaves as a proper host. He offers food, shelter, and conversation, even while the political center of the island has been hollowed out by the suitors. Odysseus listens carefully, learns the state of his household, and waits. The poem lingers on this because Ithaca is not just a location, it is a social order under strain. Odysseus needs to know who remains loyal, who has broken faith, and how far the damage has spread while he was away. Eumaeus matters not only as a helper but as a surviving example of the kind of household discipline the suitors have undermined. The next recognition comes with Telemachus, and here the poem gives one of its most controlled reversals. Father and son do not rush into public reunion. Athena restores Odysseus's appearance, and Telemachus recognizes him privately. The epic treats that moment as necessary preparation for the larger act of justice to come. It is also one of the places where the poem makes kinship feel practical rather than abstract. Telemachus is not simply told that his father has come back. He is brought into the knowledge gradually because the restoration of the house depends on alliance, timing, and secrecy. In the larger structure of the Odyssey, this is a reversal of the opening. At the beginning, Telemachus was uncertain, young, and surrounded by men consuming his inheritance. Here, father and son can finally act together, but only after the son has been drawn into adult responsibility. After that, Odysseus enters the hall where the suitors have consumed his property and pressed Penelope toward a new marriage. In Homer, this is not merely a family dispute. It is a collapse of household order, guest friendship, and proper rule. The suitors have behaved as if the absence of the master makes the house available for endless use, but the poem presents that behavior as a violation of norms that should bind even powerful men. Odysseus listens, endures insults, and tests the people around him. He does not strike immediately, because the epic wants the return to power to be intelligible as justice rather than anger alone. In that sense, the long concealment is part of the proof. A king who cannot control himself would not restore his own house. Odysseus has to show mastery over timing before he can show mastery over violence. Penelope is tested as well. In the poem, she is careful, indirect, and difficult to read, and that difficulty is part of her dignity. She does not simply accept the first claim made to her. She uses delay, questioning, and caution, which places her alongside Odysseus rather than against him. This is important because the Odyssey does not present her as passive or foolish. She is one of the few characters who can match Odysseus in the discipline of withholding certainty. Her behavior also reflects the same social world as the hero's disguise. In a house crowded by claimants, truth cannot always announce itself at once. It has to be tested through signs that belong to shared memory and household knowledge. Her great test is the bed. Odysseus describes the bed built around a living olive tree, and Penelope's response proves that she knows the secret only the true husband would know. Recognition in the Odyssey is rarely a matter of names alone. It rests on shared knowledge, objects, wounds, and domestic memory. That is why the reunion feels earned. It is not announced by spectacle, but by the recovery of details that belong to one household. The olive tree matters because it is rooted in the land and worked into the structure of the marriage bed. In later interpretation, that has often been taken to suggest permanence, but in Homer, it is more immediate than symbol alone. It is the hidden fact that cannot be guessed by an outsider. Penelope's question forces Odysseus to reveal whether he truly knows the house he claims to reclaim. Only then does the reunion become secure. The killing of the suitors follows in Homer, and it is part of the poem's severe justice. The scene has often been treated as the violent climax of the story, but the epic frames it as retribution after long abuse. The suitors have not simply courted Penelope. They have exhausted resources, mocked old dependents, and treated the household as already conquered. In that setting, the slaughter is not presented as random violence, but as a restoration of violated order through the means available in heroic culture. Even so, the ending does not close there. Odysseus still has to be recognized by Laertes, his father, and that final recognition returns the story to the family line that began before the war at Troy. Laertes sees the proof in signs tied to the family and the land, not in grand speeches. Again, the poem prefers exactness over display. The recognition of father and son completes not only a personal reunion, but a continuity of household and inheritance that stretches back beyond the Trojan War itself. There are, however, other ancient and later versions of the ending. Some traditions extend the story beyond Homer and imagine further conflict, often involving the families of the slain suitors or a later death for Odysseus himself. In the Telegony, a later epic now lost, except in summary, Odysseus has additional adventures and is eventually killed by his son Telegonus. That belongs to a later poetic cycle, not to the Odyssey. Other local traditions linked Odysseus's death or later fate to different places in Greece or Italy. These are not simple replacements for Homer's ending. They show how widely the figure of Odysseus traveled in Greek memory. Once the Homeric hero entered the broader mythic tradition, communities and poets could reshape him to fit local stories, genealogies, and claims of ancestry. The return to Ithaca remained central, but it was no longer the only possible ending. The historical record is not from Odysseus's life, which belongs to epic tradition, but from the long afterlife of the poem. The Odyssey is usually dated by scholars to the early Greek epic tradition, shaped in oral performance and later fixed in writing. That oral background matters. It helps explain why the homecoming is built from repeated recognitions, formulaic scenes of hospitality, and a strong sense that behavior can reveal identity as much as speech can. In that world, a hero is known by how he receives others, how he endures delay, and how he restores right order in his own house. The poem's repeated tests are not decorative. They are the narrative form of a culture that placed weight on oath, guest friendship, kinship, and the public visibility of proper conduct. Odysseus became one of the most influential figures in Greek literature because he could stand for more than one value at once. He is clever, but not only clever. He is persuasive, but not always trustworthy. He survives by intelligence, yet that same intelligence sometimes brings danger on himself and others. Later Greek writers, especially tragedians and philosophers, treated him in different ways. Some admired his practical wisdom. Others distrusted the kind of intelligence that can also become manipulation. In Roman literature, Virgil gives him a more ambivalent place, and later European writers repeatedly return to the same tension between endurance, cleverness, and the cost of survival. The return to Ithaca, then, is not just an ending to one poem. It became a model for thinking about what kind of person can re-enter society after disruption, and what price is paid when survival depends on deception. The symbols around the ending are just as durable. The olive tree bed has often been read as a sign of rooted marriage, household continuity, and the living bond between person and place. The bow, the disguise, the testing of identities, and the sealed recognition within the family all point to a hero whose victory depends not on conquest abroad, but on preserving the structures of home. The bow in particular fits the same pattern. Odysseus endures because his story never treats victory as simple. He is clever, but never free of consequence. Favored by gods, he must still rely on patience, disguise, memory, and restraint. He wins his home by surviving loss, not by avoiding it. That is why the Odyssey stayed meaningful for Greek audiences and later readers alike. It presents a hero whose greatest achievement is not conquest, but return. The journey ends where it was always heading, toward the household, the marriage bed, the inherited land, and the difficult work of recognition. In that final shape, Odysseus becomes more than a wanderer. He is the man who comes back carrying the cost of having lived through the world.